Holy words.
The Glendale Road Church of Christ proudly presents a weekly exploration of the Word of our living God. This is It Is Written with Minister Stephen Hunter.
Oh, let the ancient words impart.
Thankfully, God's mercy is always available, and it's always open to the roughest of us all. And this story, the prodigal son, that you're very familiar with, is not anything new. And the majority of you who've heard this sermon preached by countless preachers over a series of years, you're probably thinking, well, I've heard this one before. And it could be that that is the case, but it may be that there's someone who'll hear it today that it'll actually pierce them where they need to be pierced. That it may actually cause them to want to respond. And so I tried to think, what's a good approach to this particular passage that we've heard a lot about? Well, and I thought, God is calling the prodigal, and that's a song and that we just sang. And I'm thankful that Derek led us in that song because he does call the prodigal. And we're not talking necessarily miraculously, but we're talking rather through circumstances and various other ways. But the thing is, no matter where you are, if you're in that season of prodigal living, you have a God that loves you. You have a God that is anticipating and looking for you to come back to Him. When you read this story of the prodigal son, the one thing that you notice, that I always notice, is that when the son starts to make his way back home, his daddy is there waiting on him and runs to very excitedly meet him and to greet him in that state. Now, Luke 15 is what I'd call the lost chapter of the Bible, because starting out Luke 15, there's the parable of the lost sheep. Then right after that, there's the parable of the lost coin. The conclusion of each of those parables has assigned to it a passage that the Holy Spirit gave by divine inspiration to Luke, that when one sinner repents, the hosts of heaven rejoice. That when one sinner repents, the angels rejoice in heaven. And so I just want us to think, before we get right into this, look around you where you're sitting right now. And I guarantee that you'll probably notice that there's an empty space where someone once sat. And I'm going to ask you, what have you done to reach out to that one missing person? What have you done? Have you called them? Have you visited them? Perhaps even sent a card? Have you invited them into your home? Now, we're not talking about people that have left Glendale and have gone and are worshiping with another congregation. We're talking about people who are sincerely prodigals. What have you done? Not what have I done, what has Gary done, what have you done? If any man is so overtaken in a trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of meekness and gentleness, taking heed to yourself, lest you should also stumble. Galatians 6:1. Verse 2, and so fulfill the law of Christ. You see, the remarkable thing about New Testament Christianity is that we don't have a priesthood. The Bible refers to all believers as priests. The Bible refers to all believers as saints. And it doesn't take a title, and it doesn't take an office for you to do what we should all be doing. So what have you done? God always does His part. And He has entrusted to us the responsibility, He has entrusted to us the task of preaching the gospel. But not only preaching the gospel to the lost, but also seeing after those lost sheep, those lost coins, trying to regain them, also chasing after those prodigal sons. And so when you fix your heart and your mind upon how it is that God operates, And when you think about the various ways that we could be engaged in the work of trying to recall or regain a prodigal, we notice first in this passage that one of the ways that God calls the prodigal is through their circumstances. This boy was given his portion of the inheritance. And he went in a prodigal land, he went in a foreign land, he spent everything, and there arose a severe famine. And so he began to be in want. And while he's in want, he joins himself to a citizen of the country, and this citizen sends him into his fields to feed swine. Now, if you're a first century Jew, and you're hearing this story taught, or told rather, you understand that having anything to do with what this boy has done is all bad, all around. First of all, he goes to his daddy and he says, I want the inheritance that falls to me. It would have been as well as him to say, I kind of wish you were already dead so that I had my share. That's about what that meant. But his daddy, being loving as he was, gave him the inheritance that was due to him upon the father's own death. And so the son doesn't stay on the family farm. He picks up and he goes to a foreign land. There's clue number one. He has chosen to leave the promised land. This guy's not any good. Clue number two, when you read later on in the parable, the older brother says that he has spent his money on riotous living, among which was his taking prostitutes to himself. There's problem number two. And so he's in this foreign land and he goes and he joins himself to a citizen of the country, to a Gentile. Problem number three. Then he's sent to the field where the swine are, working with an unclean animal. There's another problem. And so this guy has hit rock bottom. When you think about it in Jewish terms, he is at the very bottom of the barrel. The most miserable place he could be, the most miserable state in which he could find himself, that's where he is. But that's exactly where some of us in our hard-heartedness and our stubbornness have to get before we'll realize just how great God is. Sometimes we've got to get all the way down in the mire. We've got to get down at the bottom of the barrel before we finally look up to God, which is where we should have been looking the entire time, and realize this is not the place for me. You remember those old Ace commercials with John Madden? He'd always close by saying, "And Ace is a place for me." You know what? The field of swine, the foreign country, that's not the place to us. And the reason this is also foreign to this guy is because he was brought up in a good, faithful Jewish home. So you can't ever look at this and say, well, the father just wasn't a good parent. I was talking to a lady a few years ago. Her father's a preacher, was a preacher, and she is in her 50s. Her father's in his 80s, rather. And she was talking to me about raising children, this, that, and the other, and she said, you know, my daddy is of the opinion that if someone's children don't do how they're supposed to do, then it's the parents' fault. They've done something wrong. I said, well, if we're going to use that line of reasoning, then we have to be willing to say that God's parenting of the first two human beings was wrong. You know, sometimes parents do the absolute best they can. They give a good Christian home, good Christian instruction. They're supportive, they're loving, they're merciful, they're gracious to their kids. And their kids grow up and they just go a totally different direction than how the parents would have ever intended. Some with teenagers have said and told me in times past, they said, I don't know what they were thinking. I brought them up better than that. I'm sure anybody who's been an elder or a minister or who's been involved in the lives of other Christians who've had children that have gone astray have heard, I've taught them better than that. And yeah, likely we have. But we've got to realize every person has free will. And they can choose to either follow that good godly counsel or they can choose to rebel against it, which some have. I remember my great-grandmother, when I would spend the summers with her in Carlisle, Indiana, she would have a saying, because some of the boys that were from that area, we'd go, it was a very small town, kind of like Mayberry. I felt like Opie Taylor running around that little small town. You got the town square, this, that, and the other. And she'd give me a few dollars, and, you'd go down, and they actually had, a little diner, if you will, where you could get milkshakes and things like that. It was great. And so I'd go out there, and I'd say, Granny, I'm going out with, this guy and that guy. And she'd always say one thing to me before I left. She'd say, all right, remember who you are, and remember whose you are. Anybody hear that growing up? Anybody? You got a hand that works? Some of you have. Okay, yeah. Now, I always thought, well, that's just something that older people are supposed to say. It's in the when you're a grandmother handbook, right? Remember who you are and remember whose you are. And I remember sometime talking to her when I was back home on the phone. I was in middle school, and I was telling her about my girlfriend. I had this new girlfriend. Oh, she was pretty. I said, Granny, she's just the sweetest girl. She's really pretty. She's popular, all this stuff. And, oh, that's nice. That's nice, son. And then at the end of the conversation, she'd say, now you remember who you are, and you remember whose you are. And I guess it wasn't until I was adult that saying actually had meaning to me. Remember who you are. Remember who you've been brought up to be. Remember whose you are. In her terminology meant you are Christ's. Don't shame him. And I wish I could say that I always remembered who I was and whose I was, but the fact is I didn't. And a lot of people haven't either. But this boy had a good upbringing, no doubt. And that's shown by the fact that he looks to that upbringing, he looks to that home as a place to return to after choosing to live the life that he'd chosen to live. And so he was at the point where he would have gladly eaten the pods that the swine ate, but they gave him nothing. Now we see elsewhere in the Scriptures where God has used circumstances. In Joel 1, 2-4, God says, hear this, you elders, and give ear, all you inhabitants of the land. Has anything like this happened in your days, or even in the days of your fathers? Tell it to your children, and let your children tell their children, and their children another generation. What the chewing locust left, the swarming locust has eaten. What the swarming locust left, the crawling locust has eaten. And what the crawling locust left, the consuming locust has eaten. Now, we don't understand this too much. Maybe farmers do. When pests comes through and they devour your crops, this was a famine so bad. This was a swarm of locusts so bad that God says in Joel chapter 1, look at your circumstances. Has anything this bad ever happened in your lifetime or your daddy's lifetime? So I want you to tell your kids and have them tell their kids. This is how bad it was. Some of you used to tell your children and your grandchildren about Pearl Harbor. But then, your grandchildren, perhaps even great-grandchildren, our Pearl Harbor was 9/11. And freshmen in high school right now are learning about 9/11 as a historical event because they weren't born yet. And so I could talk to my children about where I was when I learned about it and when I saw the footage on television. And up to that point in my life, I go, I've never seen anything like this. And so through the circumstance, at least in the prodigal son's life and also in Israel's life, the circumstance was meant to get them to refocus. Has it ever been this bad? So I'm going to point it and turn it to you, the audience. What is it you're living through right now that's so bad? What is it that keeps you awake at night? What is it right now that just consumes your thought, that steals your joy, perhaps even causes you to cry? Could it be that God is trying to use that circumstance in your life to wake you up and get you to focus on what really matters? Because you see, just being in a church building on a Sunday morning does not mean that you are faithful to God the rest of the time. I remember a Sunday school teacher telling me one time, she said, Stephen, this little girl was in class and we were talking about what it meant to be a Christian. We were talking about what it meant to love God, to be faithful to God. And she said, do you know what this little girl said to me? About 6, 7 years old, this girl was. And I said, no, tell me. She said, that little girl said, my daddy's only a Christian at church on Sundays. Do you get that? Do you understand what that little girl was saying? You see, they were talking about what it meant to live like a Christian, to talk like a Christian, to act like a Christian who loves God and is faithful to God. And that little 6-year-old girl was wise enough and smart enough to know that the only time her daddy acted that way was at church on Sundays. How many of us parents would hate for our little children to say the only time they're a Christian is when they're in this building? So being here on Sundays doesn't mean that you're faithful. So what is the circumstance right now in your life? And you do a good self-examination and you ask yourself, is God using this to try to get my attention? Have I neglected Him in this aspect of my life? Have I neglected Him? Do I put on the face only when I go to church and when I'm around church people? I've told you several times, you can fool us, but you can't fool God. And I'll tell you right now, if anyone needs to be fooled, it's not us. We will not judge you on that last day. He will. So sometimes circumstances get our attention. Sometimes conscience gets our attention. Luke 15:17, when He came to Himself. You see, He had to get so low down, He had to get to such a point that it finally snapped in His brain and He said, what am I doing here? I can't tell you how many times I've talked to people, and I have been one myself. They get to a point in their prodigal living and they go, I don't know why I did it. There's a good friend of mine who was an alcoholic for years. His parents sent him through treatments. He got in trouble with the law, so forth and so on. Finally got himself cleaned up. Finally was living a life of sobriety. He was at his apartment and his neighbor asked him for some help, so he goes and he helps his neighbor do something. I think he had some damage in his apartment, so they were cleaning it up and getting it put back together, livable. And at the end of that work, the neighbor went to his refrigerator, got a beer out, and he said, hey man, you want a beer? And he said, sure. So he took a beer and he drank one. Before he knew it, he was drinking a second, then a third, then a fourth, then a fifth. And his new wife called her mother-in-law and her father-in-law and said, he is drunk. He's passed out here in the apartment. And so they come out and they stay with them throughout the night. And the next day he wakes up feeling like 9 miles of bad road. And they ask him, they say, what happened? Why did you do it? You've been sober for so many years, for so many months. His reply was, I have no idea why I did it. He said, we were in the moment, we were cleaning the guy's house, and he offered me a beer, and I just said, sure. Now, some people who don't struggle with that look and go, well, you just need to have self-control. Well, you just need to, listen. A lot of people who do the things that they do, the sinning that they sin, are people who, once they get to the realization of themselves, they go, why did I do that? I have no idea whatsoever. Timothy records, as Paul wrote to him, the Spirit expressly says that in latter times some will depart from the faith, giving heed to deceiving spirits and doctrines of demons, speaking lies and hypocrisy, having their own conscience seared with a hot iron. When you get to the point that you just don't care anymore, when you get to the point that you just cast off all sense and reason, that's a scary thing to get. I told you several weeks ago, about a couple that there was an adultery that took place at the church where I was, and it had a good ending to the story. They both repented and so forth. But, from the point in which everyone knew about this until at least the guilty man repented, he was very volatile, saying he didn't care, saying he was going to kill himself and kill other people. And, sometimes people get to a boiling point, they get to a breaking point, And we may not understand why it is, but they can get there. And so we read all the way back in Proverbs, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Now, I want you to understand that Proverbs is not a certainty. Proverbs are a probability. The better odds we give our children good, godly instruction as they grow up, the better odds that if they ever do become prodigals, the better the odds that they will return. And so through this guy's circumstances, through his conscience, there he is being called, but also through a sense of certainty. When he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have bread enough to eat and spare, and I perish with hunger? I'll arise and I'll go to my father and I'll say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you, and I'm no longer worthy to be called your son, so make me like one of your hired servants. The one thing that this boy knew that we as Christians should know is that we can't go back to the Father's house. If he didn't have that certainty that, you know what, here I am in the pigsty, here I am, dirty, unclean, ceremonially, and every which other way from Sunday. But I know that I can rise up, I know that I can go to my dad's house, and I know that there I'll receive some sense of mercy. Going back to Joel, God said to Joel's audience, to Israel, he says, turn to me with all your heart, with fasting, with weeping, and with mourning. So rend your heart and not your garments. Return to the Lord your God, for he's gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and of great kindness, and he relents from doing harm. The certainty that the prodigal son had should be the same certainty that we have. That is, if we go back to God in repentance, if we go back to God in humility, if we go back to God in our brokenness, that this loving, merciful God whom we serve, that created us, will allow us to come back. The story of the prodigal son is really a good story for every daddy to read. Because I know a lot of times we fathers are we're a lot tougher on our kids than mamas are. Mamas will always love and hold out hope for their kids, no matter how bad they get. Daddies, sometimes we're ready to give up on them because we get so frustrated. But the example that we have of how God loves his children ought to be how we, as fathers, love our physical children as well. And that if our children do decide to go down a path that we don't agree with, they'll know that we do not condone their actions. They'll know that we do not condone where they're going in life. But I hope that they would also know that if they hit their rock bottom, we'll be there, not to bail them out, but we'll be there to love them. Why? Because God has loved all of us in our brokenness, and he still does. Be very cautious, because one moment of weakness can lead to a lifetime of regret. One moment of weakness can lead to a lifetime of regret. I dare say if you were to talk to Moses today and say, Moses, you know that part in the book of Numbers where you struck the rock when you were supposed to command it to give its waters? Moses would probably say, yeah, I remember that. Moses, if you could go back and do it all over again, would you do that over? I dare say Moses would probably say, yeah, I would. That one moment of weakness that Moses had with frustration, that he had of just being tired of the entire nation of Israel and all their grumblings and their complainings, something we can understand. That one moment of weakness, the result was God saying to Moses, you will not go into the promised land. Moses had one moment of weakness, and there you see a lifetime of regret. You go all the way to 2 Samuel when David sleeps with Bathsheba, another man's wife. Then, to cover up his sin, he orchestrates it so that her husband is killed on the front line of battle. Then Nathan the prophet comes with the message of God rebuking David the king. If you would talk to David today and say, David, do you regret it? I dare say that he would probably say that he did. One moment of weakness led to a lifetime of regret because the result of David's actions had to do with his son, his own flesh and blood, rising up against him, and his house being in perpetual turmoil the rest of his life. One moment of weakness can lead to a lifetime of regret. And here's the thing. These sisters that have come forward over the past couple of weeks, we as Christians don't need to look at them and see their mistakes or their sins. I've never believed that anyone who makes a mistake or anyone who sins should be defined by their worst moment. I don't know if you're anything like me, but I love a good comeback story. Remember The Titans, one of the greatest films out there. A good comeback story when you think there's no way they're going to pull this off. The Mighty Ducks, for those of us of a certain generation, I suppose. Remember the comeback story. Rocky, the comeback story. We all love a good comeback story. And you know, some of our own brethren right now are living out their own comeback story. They shouldn't be defined by their worst moment. Thankfully, God doesn't define us by our worst moments. But when you look at a person who has fallen hard, hopefully you look and you see, boy, and that you can say, they've come a long way. I've heard that about several of brothers or sisters here. I've heard it at every congregation where I've been to. They say, now that one right there, you know, years ago they used to. But I've also heard following that, they've come a long way, and I'm sure proud of them. You are not defined by your worst moment, but you can be defined by how you come back. If you're a Christian and you need to come back to the Lord now as we stand together and sing.
Holy words,
This has been It Is Written, presented by the Glendale Road Church of Christ. We welcome your visits and communications at any time.
sound with God's own heart. Oh, let the ancient words impart.